Imagine you are looking at a GPS map on your phone, right?
Right.
The blue line is just perfectly clear. The route is entirely highlighted. It tells you precisely, like, exactly how many minutes it will take to get to your destination.
Yeah, totally frictionless.
Exactly. But what happens when that map is perfectly accurate and the roads are completely clear, but the person gripping the steering wheel is just completely psychologically compromised?
Well, it's the ultimate blind spot, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, we love to focus on the external obstacles because they are visible. We can measure a mountain. We can gauge the exact depth of a river.
Right, it's just data.
But measuring the internal fractures within a leadership structure, or like trying to find the psychological breaking point of a massive organization, that is where the real, actual danger lies.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to decode a genuinely surprising section of one of the most famous strategic texts in human history, which is Sun Tzu's Art of War.
It really is surprising.
It is, and we are looking specifically at Chapter 10. It is titled simply Terrain. But we aren't just looking at the core text today. We have this massive stack of centuries of historical commentary accompanying it.
Yeah, we've got insights from ancient Chinese scholars and generals, people like Tu Yu and Chao Kum.
Right, all the way up to these really interesting modern comparisons from British military officers like General Baden-Powell and Colonel Henderson.
And what you quickly realize when you layer all these brilliant military minds on top of each other is that this is absolutely not a geography lesson.
Yeah, not at all.
Like, if you're tuning in thinking we're just going to talk about how to read a topographic map or where to pitch a tent, you are going to be shocked.
Totally.
This text is a profound, almost disturbing look at the intersection of physical space, extreme leadership psychology, catastrophic management failures, and this just razor wire balance between radical empathy and ruthless discipline.
Okay, let's unpack this
Yeah.
because right out of the gate, there is a massive surprise for the reader here.
Yeah, there really is.
In a chapter literally titled Terrain, you would naturally assume it's all about dirt, hills, rivers, valleys, ground stuff.
Right, the physical environment.
But if you actually measure the text, only about a third of it discusses the physical ground. The vast majority of this chapter plunges incredibly deep into human behavior, the internal faults of leaders, and the psychological state of an organization.
It's wild.
Why would a chapter on geography spend most of its time analyzing human psychology?
What's fascinating here is that to these ancient strategists, there was absolutely no separation between the two.
Really? None.
None. The physical environment and the psychological state of an army are just inextricably connected. You cannot master the physical terrain without first mastering yourself and your people.
Oh, wow.
The external map is utterly useless if the internal map of the leader's mind is a complete disaster zone. I mean, Sun Tzu is basically setting up a framework where the ground you stand on amplifies the flaws you carry within you.
That is a wild concept. Before we can even look at the enemy, we have to look at the ground beneath our feet. And before we look at the ground, we have to look in the mirror.
Precisely.
But I guess to follow the logic of the text, before we get into the complex minds of these generals and leaders, we first have to understand the literal physical ground they are walking on. Sun Tzu kicks off by distinguishing 6 classifications of terrain. Let's start right there.
Yeah, so the very first one he outlines is what he calls accessible ground.
Right. Ground which can be freely traversed by both sides. And one of the historical commentators, Mei Yaoqin, adds a note here explaining that this means ground that is plentifully provided with roads and means of communications.
It's the open playing field.
The leveled up arena, basically. But Sun Tzu gives a very specific, unbreakable rule for this kind of environment. He says, be before the enemy in occupying the raised and sunny spots and carefully guard your line of supplies. Then you will be able to fight with advantage.
And that last phrase, they carefully guard your line of supplies bit, it really needs to be deeply examined.
Yeah.
Tu Yu, another ancient commentator, he chimes in to say, this simply means not allowing the enemy to cut your communications. But we have to really think about the physical mechanics of an ancient army.
Right, it's not just radios.
Exactly. It goes so much deeper than just keeping a dirt road open. If you can't feed your people, if your messengers cannot safely ride back and forth to deliver orders, your entire command structure just evaporates. I mean, Napoleon had a famous dictum that the secret of war lies in the communications.
We actually have this incredible analysis from Colonel Henderson in our sources expanding on this exact point. He compares a line of supply to a human heart.
Yes, and it is a brilliant, highly accurate metaphor. Henderson basically says the line of supply is as vital to the existence of an army as the heart is to the life of a human being.
Wow.
He asks you to imagine a commander whose communications are suddenly threatened. He compares them to a duelist.
Okay, a sword fight.
Right, imagine you are in a sword fight. You have a plan, you have your footwork down, you're looking for an opening, and suddenly you realize your guard is completely astray, and your adversary's point is already menacing you with certain death.
Oh, man. At that exact second, your grand strategy just goes right out the window.
Completely.
You weren't trying to win the duel anymore. You were just desperately trying to survive the next second.
Precisely. Henderson points out that the commander in that situation is compelled to conform to his adversary's movements. You lose all autonomy.
You're purely reactive.
You are no longer acting, you are merely reacting. You have to content yourself with just warding off thrusts. You find yourself in a horribly false position, basically forced to change all your carefully laid plans.
Yeah.
You're forced to split your forces into these isolated panic detachments and are forced to fight with inferior numbers on ground you just haven't prepared.
And the result, Henderson notes, isn't just an ordinary run-of-the-mill failure. It entails the absolute ruin or the complete surrender of the whole army.
It's a cascading domino effect. You lose the supply line, so you lose your posture, which means you lose your autonomy, and then you just lose the battle.
It all stems from not guarding the heart. So that is accessible ground. The rules are clear, but the stakes are absolute. Now, the second terrain he brings up is entangling ground.
Right.
Ground which can be abandoned, but is incredibly hard to reoccupy. Mei Yao Chen calls this a net-like country. You venture in and you become entangled.
The strategic and psychological dynamic here is just fascinating. Sun Tzu says that from this kind of entangling position, if the enemy is unprepared, you might sally forth and defeat them.
Okay.
But if they are prepared for your coming and you fail to defeat them, return is impossible. Disaster will inevitably ensue.
You know, trying to make a modern connection here, this feels exactly like making a bold, irreversible life or business decision.
How so?
Think about someone quitting a stable, salaried corporate job to launch a startup in a highly competitive tech field. Oh, I see. It's a good starting point, but let's take it further and really look at the actual mechanics of the terrain.
Yeah.
In a modern startup, you usually have the ability to pivot. On Sun Tzu's entangling ground, there is no pivot. The physical mechanics of the space. I mean, imagine deep marshlands, dense, thorny forests, or steep, muddy ravines.
Right.
Gravity and exhaustion actively prevent a retreat. If you fail your initial strike, the enemy's counterattack will catch your army while they are literally stuck in the mud.
That is terrifying.
It's not just a sunk cost or a failed business venture. It is total annihilation. The terrain itself acts as a one-way valve.
That makes the startup analogy even heavier, honestly. Like, you can abandon your old job. That is the easy part. Stepping into the net is easy.
Exactly.
But if the market, which is the enemy in this scenario, is totally prepared for you, if the competitors are entrenched and your launch fails, you can't just casually stroll back into your old corporate gig. Return is impossible. Yeah. You are caught in the net.
Right. It is all about the deep asymmetry of risk.
On accessible ground, both sides can move freely back and forth. You can probe, retreat, and try again tomorrow. But on entangling ground, the door only swings outward. It is a one-way door decision.
It requires absolute commitment.
Total commitment. It requires a level of absolute certainty and perfect intelligence gathering that accessible ground simply doesn't demand of a leader.
Okay, what about the third one? Temporizing ground. Sun Tzu says this is a position where neither side will gain by making the first move.
Yeah.
Tu Mu notes that each side finds it physically inconvenient to move forward, so the situation remains at a tense deadlock.
Deadlocks are incredibly dangerous, not necessarily because of the physical terrain, but because they breed extreme psychological impatience.
We hate waiting.
Human nature hates a stalemate.
Yeah.
We are biased toward action. We want to do something. But Sun Tzu's advice here is very counterintuitive.
What does he say?
He says, even if the enemy offers you an incredibly attractive bait, like, as Tu Yu suggests, turning their backs and pretending to flee in panic, you should not stir forth.
Don't take the bait, even if it looks like the easiest win in the world.
Especially if it looks easy.
Yeah.
Instead, you retreat. You actively entice the enemy in turn. You wait.
Wow.
You wait until only part of their army has come out of their advantageous position, and then you deliver your attack. You are literally manipulating their psychological impatience against them.
That is brilliant.
Yeah,
You are waiting for their human nature to override their strategic discipline.
exactly.
So, we have accessible, entangling, temporizing. The next two are narrow passes and precipitous heights. And the rules for these seem pretty straightforward at first glance, but the implications for how a leader has to think are just huge.
They really are.
For narrow passes, he says if you can occupy them first, strongly garrison them and wait for the enemy. Tu points out that this gives you the initiative to make sudden and unexpected attacks.
Right.
But if the enemy forestalls you and fully garrisons the pass before you arrive, do not go after them. Only attack if it's weakly garrisoned.
The exact same logic applies to the fifth category, which is precipitous heights. If you get there first, occupy the raised and sunny spots and wait.
Okay.
Kung notes that the massive advantage of securing heights and defiles is that your actions can no longer be dictated by the enemy. You hold the pen. You are writing the script for the battle.
You have total control.
Right. And again, if the enemy beats you to it, do not follow them up the mountain. Retreat and try to entice them away.
It sounds so simple, right? Like if they beat you to it, walk away. But think about the psychology of sunk costs here.
Oh, yeah.
You have marched your army for 2 weeks to get to this mountain. You finally arrive and you see enemy flags at the top. The sheer ego it takes for a general to say, well, we were too slow, turn around, instead of forcing an attack to save face, that is incredibly difficult.
It is a massive blow to the ego.
But the historical commentary here provides an absolutely mind-blowing anecdote about the importance of these heights that isn't just about fighting the enemy. Cheng Yu tells the story of Pei Xingchen.
Yes, a highly regarded general from the 7th century operating around 692 to 682 AD. Pei Xingchen was sent on a punitive expedition against Turkic tribes.
I want you to picture this scenario. Like, put yourself in the shoes of a frontline infantryman in this army.
Okay.
It's late, it's getting dark. The general orders the camp to be pitched, so you and your fellow soldiers spend hours doing grueling manual labor. You dig the deep ditches, you build the defensive earthen walls.
Backbreaking work.
Right. The camp is completely fortified, your hands are blistered, you are freezing, you are exhausted, you finally sit down to eat, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, Pei Xingchen gives a shocking order. The entire army has to shift its quarters to a nearby hill immediately.
And you can imagine the sheer outrage. I mean, it's not just murmuring. The officers are furious.
I would be too.
They protest loudly and aggressively against the extra fatigue this is going to cause the men who just finished building a perfectly good fort. But Pei Xingchen pays absolutely no heed to their remonstrances.
He just ignores them.
Completely ignores them. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't hold a town hall to discuss their feelings. He forces the move as quickly as possible under threat of severe punishment.
And then comes the terrifying payoff. That exact same night, a terrific storm rolls in. And we aren't talking about a light drizzle here. It completely floods their former encampment.
Yeah.
We're talking rapid floodwaters over 12 feet deep. The old camp, the one they had spent hours digging and fortifying, is totally violently underwater.
It is crazy. The recalcitrant officers are standing on this new hill in the pouring rain, looking down at the valley where they would have all drowned in their sleep, just absolutely amazed.
Yeah, their outrage turns into pure awe.
Right. They admit they were wrong, they come to him, and they ask, how did you know what was going to happen?
And his response is so cold, so calculating. He doesn't give them a weather lesson. He just looks at them and says, from this time forward, be content to obey orders without asking unnecessary questions.
It's a chilling, monumental moment of command. But Cheng Yu brings it back to the core lesson of the terrain. High and sunny places are advantageous, not just because they give you a tactical edge against enemy troops charging uphill. They are advantageous because they make you immune from disastrous natural phenomena.
Right.
What's vital to understand here is that the environment is treated as an active, lethal participant in the battle. Seeking the raised spots is literally about surviving nature itself.
Because nature doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't care whose side you are on. If you are in the valley when the 12-foot wall of water hits, your brilliant strategy doesn't matter. You are gone.
Precisely. The terrain is a neutral, unforgiving third party that will annihilate whoever fails to respect its physical rules.
Yeah.
And just to round out the physical categories, the sixth one is positions at a great distance from the enemy.
Right, distance.
If the two armies are equal in strength but stationed far apart, provoking a battle is not easy. Tu explains the underlying mechanics of this. Undertaking a long, wearisome march means your troops arrive physically
Their
exhausted.
boots are worn through, their rations are depleted.
Exactly. While your adversary has been sitting perfectly still, fresh and keen, fighting under those physical conditions will always be to your disadvantage.
So those are the 6 principles connected directly with the Earth. Accessible, entangling, temporizing, narrow passes, precipitous heights, and great distances.
Yeah.
Sun Tzu wraps up this section by stating that the general who has attained a responsible post must be extremely careful to study them. But this is exactly where the text makes a massive, stark pivot. We're moving completely off the physical map.
Right. Surviving 12-foot floods and navigating narrow mountain passes is only half the battle. Sun Tzu introduces a totally new list.
Okay.
He says an army is exposed to 6 several calamities, and he explicitly, forcefully states these do not arise from natural causes.
They don't come from the Earth.
Right. And they don't even come from the enemy. They arise entirely from faults for which the general is directly responsible.
Okay, think about this. The worst disasters an organization faces aren't the economy, they aren't the weather, and they aren't the brilliant moves of their competitors. They are the internal, psychological, and organizational failures of their own leader.
It is entirely an internal battlefield. The general is the literal architect of their own army's destruction.
He lists the 6 internal calamities: flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, and rout. Let's go through these because the psychology here is incredibly revealing.
It really is.
First is flight. This is simple, brutal math. He says if one force is hurled against another 10 times its size, the result will be the flight of the former.
It is a wildly disproportionate application of force. It's a failure of basic calculation and reality testing by the general.
Yeah.
You are asking human beings to do the mathematically impossible? Their natural, entirely rational response is to drop their weapons and flee.
Of course it is.
The commander has failed them before the flamed arrow is even fired by placing them in an unwinnable equation.
But the next 2, insubordination and collapse, are where we get into deep, nuanced organizational psychology. These 2 are exact inverse mirrors of each other. Sun Tzu says, when the common soldiers are too strong and their officers too weak, the result is insubordination.
This is a devastating structural imbalance. And Tu Mu provides a truly tragic, pathetic, historical example of this with the case of Tianpu in 821 AD.
Oh, this story.
Yeah. Tianpu was a commander sent to Wei to lead a massive army. But his soldiers realized almost immediately that he lacked the psychological strength of command. He was soft. He was hesitant. They treated him with the utmost contempt.
The details of this are almost darkly comic if they weren't so deeply tragic.
Seriously.
The soldiers openly flouted his authority by literally riding around the military camp on donkeys, thousands of them at a time, just circling the camp on donkeys to openly mock their commanding officer.
It is insane.
And for context, riding a donkey in a military setting like this is a deliberate theatrical insult to cavalry and martial dignity.
It is the ultimate display of public disrespect. It's a complete erosion of the camp's psychological structure. And Tianpu was utterly powerless to put a stop to it.
It couldn't do anything.
He sat in his tent and let this fester for months. He heard the laughter outside and did nothing. When he finally attempted to actually engage the enemy in battle, his troops just turned tail and dispersed in every direction.
I mean, they had zero respect for him, so why on earth would they bleed for him?
Exactly. And the psychological devastation of this failure was absolute. The unfortunate Tianpu, realizing he was a general in name only, committed suicide by cutting his throat.
That is just heavy. The total literal destruction of a leader brought on entirely by an inability to project strength downward to strong subordinates.
Yeah.
But then we look at the inverse. This is the mirror image. Sun Tzu says, when the officers are too strong and the common soldiers too weak, the result is collapse.
Right. Chao Kung elaborates on this mechanism, saying the officers are energetic and desperately want to press on, but the common soldiers are feeble and suddenly collapse under the weight of the demand.
It is the breaking point of the human machine.
Exactly. The officers are relentlessly driving the men past their physical and mental limits, completely blind to the fact that the men are disintegrating beneath them.
You know, as I read this specific commentary, all I could think of was toxic corporate hustle culture.
Oh, absolutely. The parallels are almost one-to-one.
It perfectly describes it. Imagine you're an executive, So you are the officer in the scenario.
Hmm.
You are highly motivated. You have equity in the company. You have massive year-end bonuses on the line if you hit certain numbers.
Right, you're fired up.
So you are sprinting at 100 miles per hour. You are energetic. You want to press on and hit these insane, aggressive quarterly targets. But the rank and file employees, the soldiers, do not have those same incentives.
No, no.
They don't have equity. They are overworked, underpaid, and exhausted. But the executive keeps pushing and pushing, demanding late nights and weekends until the employees just physically and mentally collapse. Massive turnover, burnout, total system failure.
That is a phenomenal parallel. And what's crucial is how Sun Tzu assigns blame for this. In a modern toxic corporate environment, the executives view the collapse of the workforce as a failure of the employee's work ethic.
Right, like nobody wants to work anymore.
Exactly. But Sun Tzu explicitly categorizes this as a calamity caused by the general. It is a failure of leadership to understand the capacity, the condition, and the incentives of the people doing the actual lifting.
Wow.
The officer's energetic strength actually becomes a fatal flaw because it completely lacks empathy and realistic assessment.
So that's flight, insubordination, and collapse. The fourth internal calamity is ruin. And this one is driven by pure, unchecked emotion.
Yes.
Sun Tzu says that when the higher officers are angry and insubordinate and on meeting the enemy give battle on their own account from a feeling of resentment before the commander-in-chief can even tell whether or not he's in a position to fight, well, the result is ruin.
Emotion overriding strategy. Wang-Xi has a brilliant, penetrating note here on the mechanics of this collapse.
What does he say?
He says this happens when the general is angry without cause, and at the same time does not appreciate the ability of his subordinate officers. He rouses fierce, burning resentment in his own mid-level managers.
Oh, man.
This creates a deeply fragmented army. The subordinate commanders are no longer fighting for the general's grand strategy. They are just lashing out. They launch uncoordinated, spiteful attacks because they are mad, dragging the entire organization into an avalanche of ruin.
It's pure chaos, which leads perfectly into the fifth calamity, disorganization. This happens when the general is weak and without authority, when orders are not clear and distinct, when there are no fixed duties assigned, and the ranks are formed in a slovenly, haphazard manner.
Yeah, Tumu simply notes, neither officers nor men have any regular routine.
The historical commentaries on this specific point from Western military thinkers are truly illuminating. General Baden-Powell is quoted in our sources here, and he actually italicizes the words for heavy emphasis.
Oh, I remember this.
He says, the secret of getting successful work out of your trained men lies in one nutshell, in the clearness of the instructions they receive.
If the instructions aren't crystal clear, nothing else matters. You can have the best, most well-equipped soldiers in the world, but if they don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing on a Tuesday morning, you have systemic disorganization.
Yeah.
And Wu Zhu, a famous tactician, adds in Chapter 3 of his own treatise that the most fatal defect in a military leader is diffidence. The worst calamities that befall an army arise from hesitation.
Hesitation kills.
Exactly. Wu Liaozi echoes this perfectly. If orders are given with decision, soldiers won't wait to hear them twice. If moves are made without vacillation, soldiers won't be in two minds.
Right.
Disorganization isn't a failure of the soldier's intelligence or ability. It is entirely a failure of the leader's clarity and conviction. When the leader hesitates, the army paralyzes.
And the final calamity of the six is rout. This is when a general is fundamentally unable to estimate the enemy's strength, allows an inferior force to engage a larger one, or hurls a weak detachment against a powerful one, and crucially, neglects to place picked soldiers in the front rank.
That last detail about the picked soldiers is a masterclass in battlefield psychology.
How so?
Cheng Yu explains that whenever there is actual fighting to be done, the keenest spirits, the absolute best picked soldiers, must be put in the very front ranks.
Okay.
This achieves two massive psychological goals simultaneously. First, it strengthens the resolution of your own men standing behind them, who see their best fighters leading the charge.
Right, it boosts morale.
Second, it instantly demoralizes the enemy in front of them, who immediately face the most ferocious resistance. If you fail to set that tone immediately, the psychological momentum swings violently against you, and a disorganized rout is inevitable.
It is so striking how Sun Tzu summarizes this entire section. He says, these are 6 ways of courting defeat, which must be carefully noted by the general who has attained a responsible post.
Yeah.
He points out that the natural formation of the country, the terrain we talked about earlier, is the soldier's best ally. But the true test of a great general is the power of estimating the adversary, controlling the forces of victory, and shrewdly calculating difficulties, dangers, and distances.
He says he who knows these things and practices them will win. He who knows them not will surely be defeated.
He is placing an almost impossible godlike weight on the shoulders of the commander. If the physical terrain fails you, it is because you didn't evaluate it properly. If the army collapses internally from insubordination or disorganization, it is entirely your fault.
The general is the single point of failure. There are no excuses in this philosophy.
But if the general is entirely 100% responsible for preventing these catastrophic internal calamities, it creates a terrifying paradox. How can a general be held totally accountable for the survival of the army if they are still taking orders from a distant king who can't even see the battlefield?
Yes.
This leads us to one of the most radical, dangerous, and controversial ideas in the entire text, which is the mandate to disobey the political ruler.
This is a profound, earth-shattering shift from tactical military advice to high-level political philosophy.
Sun Tzu states it incredibly clearly, with zero ambiguity. He says, if fighting is sure to result in victory, then you must fight, even though the ruler forbid it. If fighting will not result in victory, then you must not fight even at the ruler's bidding.
It is a stunning assertion of absolute military independence from the civilian or royal government.
It really is.
Huang Shikong, a brilliantly insightful scholar from the Qin dynasty, expands on this beautifully. He explains the rationale. The responsibility of setting an army in motion must devolve on the general alone.
Why?
Because if advance and retreat are controlled by politicians sitting comfortably in the palace hundreds of miles away, brilliant results will hardly be achieved.
Because the people in the palace aren't looking at the entangling terrain. They don't see the flooded valleys, they don't see the rotting supply lines, and they don't feel the exhaustion of the demoralized troops.
No, they don't.
They are just looking at a map on a table.
Exactly. The map is not the territory. And Huang Shikong goes even further, describing how a truly enlightened monarch should behave.
What does he say?
He says the godlike ruler is content to play a surprisingly humble part in furthering their country's cause. He literally describes the political monarch as kneeling down to physically push the chariot wheel for the general.
Wow.
The decision of the military commander in the field must be absolute. Or, as Chang Yu quotes an old proverb, decrees from the Son of Heaven do not penetrate the walls of a camp.
Okay, I really have to push back here.
Go for it.
Because giving a general absolute authority to completely ignore their sovereign ruler sounds incredibly dangerous. Isn't that just a perfect, ready-made recipe for a military coup?
Oh, absolutely.
You are essentially telling a heavily armed, highly charismatic commander, hey, your boss doesn't matter, the king doesn't matter, do whatever you want if you think you're right. How do you prevent a rogue leader from just marching that army right back to the capital and taking over the throne?
It is the most vital question you could ask, and it is the central tension of military command throughout all of human history. But Sun Tzu doesn't just hand out this absolute power blindly.
Okay.
He knew exactly how dangerous it was. So he immediately follows the mandate of disobedience with a massive, absolutely critical psychological caveat, a character test.
What is the test?
He says this extreme level of disobedience is only justified for a very specific, rare type of leader. The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom.
Advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace. That is total ego death.
Complete ego death. You brought up the risk of a military coup or a rogue leader. A rogue leader acts out of a desire for fame, power, wealth, or historical glory.
Right.
Sun Tzu's mandate to disobey the ruler is only valid if the general has totally stripped their own ego out of the equation. If the general is ordered to attack by the king, but knows the terrain will destroy the army, he must disobey and retreat.
Yeah.
And as the Duke of Wellington once profoundly noted, the hardest thing of all for a soldier is to retreat.
Because it looks like cowardice. To the public, to your troops, to your king, you look weak.
Exactly. You will face intense public disgrace. The king will be furious. Your political enemies will mock you.
It's career suicide.
But the commentator Ho Shi notes that a general who is truly the jewel of the kingdom would not regret his conduct, even if he had to suffer severe punishment or execution for his disobedience. The disobedience is not an act of arrogant rebellion. It is an act of supreme, painful sacrifice. It is an act of pure protection for the country. The general must take all the political blame and demand zero of the historical glory to justify wielding that kind of absolute godlike autonomy.
It is an unbelievably high bar for leadership. So we've established that this enlightened, egoless commander has supreme, unquestioned authority over the troops and even autonomy from the ruler.
Yes.
But how should that heavy authority actually be applied to the rank-and-file soldiers on a daily basis? This brings us to a shocking paradox in the text. A leader must simultaneously show radical, almost parental empathy, while at the exact same time enforcing brutal, terrifying discipline.
It is the ultimate psychological tightrope walk. Let's examine the empathy side of the equation first.
Okay.
Sun Tzu says, "Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look upon them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death."
And Tumu gives us this visceral, unforgettable story to illustrate what regarding them as your children actually looks like in practice. He draws a vivid picture of the famous General Wu Qi.
Wu Qi is legendary for his extreme approach to leadership. The historical texts tell us he deliberately wore the exact same coarse clothes and ate the exact same meager food as the meanest, lowest of his soldiers.
He lived exactly like them.
He refused to have a horse to ride, even though he was entitled to one. He wouldn't even use a basic mat to sleep on the ground. He carried his own surplus rations wrapped in a parcel on his back just like a common foot soldier. He shared every single physical hardship.
But then there's this one specific incident that goes so far beyond just sharing hardship. It enters a realm of almost shocking intimacy.
Oh, the abscess story.
Yes. One of his common soldiers was suffering from a severely infected abscess, a terrible, purulent sore. Medical care is practically non-existent, and Wu Qi, the commander-in-chief of the entire army, gets down in the dirt and personally sucks the virus and pus out of the wound with his own mouth.
It is an act of extreme, almost revolting care. It is literally acting as a mother or father to a sick, helpless child.
Yeah.
And the story continues. The soldier's mother back home hears about what the famous Lord Wu did for her son. But she doesn't react the way you'd expect. She doesn't celebrate. She begins wailing and lamenting, crying her eyes out in despair.
Right. Someone actually approaches her and asks, "Why are you crying? Your son is just a common, expendable soldier, and the commander-in-chief himself just saved his life and sucked the poison from his sore. You should be thrilled."
But the mother's reply reveals the grim, terrifying, underlying reality of this radical empathy.
What does she say?
She says, "Many years ago, Lord Wu performed a similar service for my husband. My husband never left his side afterwards, and finally met his death at the hands of the enemy. And now that he has done the same for my son, he too will fall fighting I know not where."
That gives me chills. She wept not out of joy, but out of the grim realization of what this extreme empathy actually bought.
It is a profound, chilling psychological transaction. By treating the soldier with such overwhelming, self-sacrificing care, the general purchases a loyalty so fierce, so absolute, that it actively overrides the soldier's natural biological instinct for self-preservation.
The mother understands the economy of sacrifice.
She knows that because Wu Qi saved her son's life in such a dramatic, intimate way, her son now owes Wu Qi his death. He will stand by him even unto death, just as Sun Tzu wrote. It is an incredible demonstration of how deep paternal empathy functions as the ultimate driver of combat effectiveness.
Another commentator, Li Chuan, mentions the Viscount of Chu invading a small state in the dead of winter. The wind is howling, the soldiers are literally freezing to death in the snow.
Right.
The commander makes a physical round of the whole army, going tent to tent, just comforting and encouraging the men, patting them on the back. And the text says straight away they felt as if they were clothed in garments lined with floss silk.
Just the words of comfort from their commander actually physically warmed them.
That is the unbelievable power of the beloved son's approach.
But, and this is where the paradox hits like a hammer, Sun Tzu immediately issues a severe, urgent warning against leaning too far into that empathy.
Yeah, he takes a hard pivot into the danger of indulgence. He says, if, however, you are indulgent, but unable to make your authority felt, kind-hearted but unable to enforce your commands, and incapable, moreover, of quelling disorder, then your soldiers must be likened to spoilt children. They are useless for any practical purpose.
The boiled children. Useless. If you only provide the love, the shared hardship, and the comfort, but none of the boundary or terror of authority, the army rots from the inside.
Totally.
And Tumu provides another historical example, this one from 219 AD, regarding the general Lu Meng, which perfectly illustrates the terrifying extreme of enforcing those boundaries.
This story is so incredibly dark. So Lu Meng is occupying a town called Qiangling. And he gives stringent, absolute orders to his army. Do not molest the inhabitants and do not take anything from them by force. Zero tolerance for looting. He wants to win the hearts and minds of the locals.
A standard, clear, and highly intelligent rule to maintain order and public relations in an occupied territory.
Yeah.
But then, a certain officer serving under Lu Meng's banner commits an infraction. And importantly, this officer isn't a stranger. He happens to be a fellow townsman of Lu Meng. They grew up in the same hometown of Junan. They have history.
And what is the massive crime this childhood friend commits? He takes a single bamboo hat belonging to one of the locals. That is it. A cheap bamboo hat.
Right.
And he doesn't even take it to sell for profit. He takes it to wear over his regulation military helmet just to protect himself from the pouring rain.
It seems like the most minor, understandable infraction imaginable. A hometown friend takes a hat to stay dry while serving in your army.
Right.
But Lu Meng considers this a clear, unacceptable breach of discipline. He decides that the fact they are from the same town, that they have a personal bond, cannot be allowed to palliate or excuse the crime. The law must be absolute.
So what does he do? He orders the summary execution of his hometown friend over a bamboo hat.
He executes him, he cuts his head off.
And the text specifically notes a heartbreaking detail. Lu Meng was weeping, tears rolling down his face as he ordered the execution. I am just stunned by the contrast we are dealing with here.
It is jarring.
A few paragraphs ago, we have a general sucking the infected poison out of a soldier's wound like a loving father, and now we have a general executing a childhood friend over a hat while crying.
What's fascinating here is that the tears prove he still possessed the empathy of a father. He wasn't a psychopath. He loved his friend.
Yeah, he felt it.
But his duty as a commander, his duty to the survival of the entire army, required him to enforce the command without exception. The result of this brutal execution, Tumu notes, was that it filled the army with wholesome awe.
Wholesome awe.
From that time forth, discipline was so unimaginably perfect that even valuable articles dropped in a highway by locals were not picked up by the troops.
It is the ultimate blood-soaked version of the broken windows theory. If you execute a friend for a hat, nobody is going to steal a gold coin.
Exactly. And Liqing captures the raw psychological essence of this brutal discipline with a famous quote, "If you could make your soldiers afraid of you, they would not be afraid of the enemy."
Wow. If you make your soldiers afraid of you, they will not be afraid of the enemy. Your soldiers must be more terrified of your discipline than they are of the enemy's swords.
It is the stark, uncompromising reality of ancient command. The troops must be bound to you by an unbreakable thread of absolute love, the beloved sons who you would suck poison from, and an unbreakable thread of absolute terror, the fear of the father who will execute you for a hat.
If either of those threads snaps, you get the calamities we discussed earlier. Insubordination, collapse, or rout.
Exactly.
You have traversed an unbelievable amount of ground here. We started by mapping the physics of the terrain, navigating accessible ground, and dodging 12-foot floods on mountaintops. We pivoted to the 6 internal calamities that can collapse an organization from the inside out. We explored the heavy, ego-stripping burden of telling your royal boss no. And we just weighed the intense, horrifying tightrope walk between radical empathy and ruthless discipline.
It is a lot to process.
So how does this all synthesize? How does an ancient leader take all of this conflicting extreme data and actually guarantee success? The text concludes with a literal checklist.
Yes, Sun Tzu provides a master formula for what it means to go the full way to victory, and he does it by first defining what it looks like to only go halfway.
He lists these incomplete scenarios to prove his point. Scenario 1, if we know that our own men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware that the enemy is not open to attack, we have gone only halfway towards victory.
Chao Kung notes that the issue in this case is completely uncertain. You know yourself perfectly, your morale is high, your weapons are sharp, but you don't know the enemy. You are swinging blindly in the dark.
Scenario 2 is the exact flip side. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, but are unaware that our own men are not in a condition to attack, we have gone only halfway towards victory. You see the opening clearly, but your tool is broken.
But then comes the kicker, the third scenario, which brings us all the way back to the title of the chapter and the physical earth.
Okay.
If we know that the enemy is open to attack, and also know that our men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware that the nature of the ground makes fighting impracticable, we have still gone only halfway towards victory.
So even if the psychology is totally perfect, even if your men are ready, they love you, they fear you, the discipline is tight, and the enemy is totally vulnerable.
Right.
If you don't realize you are standing on entangling ground, or you haven't secured your supply lines like a duelist dropping his guard, or a massive flood is about to wash through the valley, you are still only halfway there.
Because the physical earth has a supreme veto over all your brilliant human preparations. The ground does not care about your empathy or your discipline.
So how does he tie it all in a bow?
Sun Tzu synthesizes all of these complex variables into this famous culmination. Hence the saying, if you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. If you know heaven and know earth, you may make your victory complete.
Heaven and earth.
Yes. The commentator Li Chuan sums up the entire philosophy brilliantly. He says that given a knowledge of three things, the affairs of men, so the psychology, the discipline, the seasons of heaven, the weather, the climate, and the natural advantages of earth, the terrain, the mountains, the marshes, victory will invariably crown your battles.
It covers everything.
And the result of doing all this incredibly complex math beforehand? Sun Tzu says the experienced soldier, once in motion, is never bewildered. Once he has broken camp, he is never at a loss.
Because the math is already done. Tumu says he has taken his measures so thoroughly as to ensure victory beforehand. Chang Yu says he doesn't move recklessly, so when he does move, he makes absolutely no mistakes.
Exactly.
He isn't figuring it out on the fly. He evaluated the weather, the mud, the morale, his own massive ego, his supply lines, and the enemy's formation before he even laced up his boots.
It is the ultimate enlightened state of tactical, environmental, and psychological preparedness.
What an incredible journey this text takes you on, and it is vital to remember as we wrap up that you don't have to be commanding an ancient Chinese army or dodging spears to use this.
Just not.
If you think about your own life, whether you are leading a massive corporate project, navigating tricky office politics, which is absolutely its own terrifying kind of entangling terrain, or just trying to make clearer, better personal decisions, the framework holds up completely.
It translates perfectly.
You have to constantly evaluate both the physical ground beneath your feet and the internal hidden motivations within yourself.
You cannot separate the external map from the internal mirror. The leader's mind is the ultimate terrain.
Exactly. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Building on everything we've decoded today, we've seen that ancient victory required mastering the physical earth, the dirt, the floods, the passes, and the visible heavens, the weather, the seasons.
Right.
But how do we apply this ultimate formula today? Think about it. When the terrain of our modern battles is no longer a physical valley or a narrow mountain pass, when it is a completely invisible digital, economic, or psychological landscape, how do you map a battlefield you can't even see?
That is the real question.
What kind of ground are you currently standing on right now, and is it secretly about to give way beneath you? We started by talking about GPS maps and how comforting it is to have clear, bright blue lines showing us exactly where to go. But after unpacking this, it becomes clear that true leadership means stepping off that comfortable map entirely and learning to navigate the muddy, unpredictable waters of the human mind and the invisible terrain around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.